We are extremely excited about this offering because we feel it finally allows us to properly close the circle between the founding intent of ACC, which was to create an interfaculty, interdisciplinary platform to conduct applied research on the specificities of the dynamics of urbanization in Africa. And over the course of the last 14 and a half years, we've developed a number of engaging methodologies to work with diverse stakeholders in the city to really knit together an organic understanding of what makes the urban transition in Africa very unique, very specific, but also why it is so difficult to intervene in these processes and to create more inclusive, more just, and more sustainable outcomes. And across our work, what has become clear is that we need professionals who are able to see the whole system and how different systems intersect at the urban scale, but also to curate the conversations and the processes to bring different disciplines and professions together to work with various societal stakeholders to build common visions and transition strategies to achieve those. And what struck us over the course of our work is how none of the existing offerings, either in planning or in design or in urban sociology or development studies, really get to the core of the kind of professional that's required to fulfill this integrative function. And so we decided that if there is nothing in the market that deals with this specific need, we will create an offering that can get there. Hence this new program, a professional master's degree in building a cohort of professionals that we call systems integrators. Now, the starting point is really a recognition that over the last 25, 30 years, there's been a profound shift in understanding of what it takes to achieve inclusive and just development processes. And so what this slide does is it just locates the South African story within this larger development policy force field that is, of course, global and has numerous dynamics that feed into it. So if we start off with when South Africa achieved independence in 1994, the embodiment of the ruling party's vision at the time was the Reconstruction and Development Program. And this recognized the importance of integrated development, but also understanding that this had to be holistic and it had to be sustainable. Now, some of the precursors to that was, of course, the world went through a major neoliberal transition from the late 70s onwards when Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister in the UK and Ronald Reagan was elected president in the US. And we saw a profound transition in development thinking around the world, manifesting in the case of Africa in structural adjustment programs. But at the same time, we also saw that there was a counterpoint to that, what one could call a social justice trajectory over that period of time. And this fed into a set of discourses around sustainable development and, very importantly, building on Amartya Sen's work of capabilities, the Human Development Reports that was published from 1990 onwards by the United Nations Development Programme. And you could read the South African transition and the tenets of the RDP, if you will, as a way of how these different forces came together and contested for meaning. And so, for example, in South Africa, we ended up with a strong social democratic vision, strong redistributive thrust. But of course, with the introduction of the new government, there was enormous financial pushback from various international bodies and financial markets. And within 2 years, South Africa had to adopt a structural adjustment program called GEAR to try and give a sense of confidence to global markets that this wasn't a socialist experiment, if you will, in the case of South Africa. Interestingly enough, within a few years, that shifted to a macro policy that tried to argue that we needed to use the needed infrastructure investments to, if you will, deal with developmental imperatives, but also within a managed fiscal framework. Internationally, we saw the introduction of the MDGs in 2000, and this really signaled the high point within the global debates where the UN system was saying that the neoliberal thrust that of the previous 20 years has produced increased levels of poverty and inequality in the world, and we needed target-driven agendas to begin to reverse that trend. In other words, they built a discourse of inclusive growth, or growth that could reduce poverty. And what we've seen is that again shifted in 2015 into the SDGs. And what the SDGs try and do is to not just deal with poverty, but to really confront the problem of unsustainable development and rising inequality as fundamental to broader development policies. And all of this, of course, manifested in various ways in South Africa, and specifically the National Development Plan. All of these debates could be seen within that. But what we've then had in 2016 was the introduction of the Integrated Urban Development Framework in South Africa that tried to really hone in on how does one deal with spatial inequality and what does inclusive holistic development at the urban scale mean. Now, I kind of spent a little bit of time on this just to capture the point that over the last 30 to 40 years, there's been very significant shifts in how we've understood what it takes to achieve developmental outcomes, and more importantly, how indivisible various socioeconomic rights are, whether they be about economic inclusion, about reducing poverty, or about living sustainability. But the question is, in this matrix of ideas, who are the people that holds that integrative picture? And that's really what I want to spend the rest of my time talking about. So the problem we see is that, yes, there's been a critique of sort of economic-centric development, first in the form of the MDGs and later the SDGs. This meant there was a broad-based acceptance of people-centered, sustainable, and participatory democratic development. And this involved accepting that development processes are innately complex, systemic, interdependent, but very importantly, also uncertain. What exactly the futures might hold is unclear. And so what this did was it destabilized this modernist confidence and conceit that we know what development looks like. And if we follow this recipe book, we can get to that particular picture. But the challenge is that, as we've seen over the last 50, 60 years, as development has become a profession, we've seen a tendency towards specialization. This manifests more broadly between economists, anthropologists, sociologists, and so forth, but particularly in the urban field, where you've got people who either come at development from an engineering perspective, or they come at it from a land use, planning, spatial perspective, or they come at it from an institutional perspective, thinking through local governance systems, effective public administration models, and so forth. But what we've seen is that as we've moved in the direction of sustainable development and a discourse of holistic, integrative development, it's been very difficult to square that with the day-to-day routines and, if you will, bureaucratic procedures that characterize city government. And in fact, there is a profound tension between these things, and it produces a sense of dissonance often, where urban professionals in municipal government or in different facets of the urban development system would have a certain disciplinary entry point, building a BRT system or being responsible for public housing, but also then feeling the imperative of responding to the need for integrative outcomes. And the logics that drive the municipal system to achieve these things are often contradictory, and how you resolve that is often completely unclear. And so what we've recognized is that today, in the context of the SDGs, the Paris Climate Agreement, Agenda 2063 for Africa, there is a very broad-based understanding that we need more integration and alignment across silos, but how to do that seems to still be somewhat of a mystery. So we want to make sure that we can respond to this demand for a new cohort of development leaders that can read systemic interdependence, can recognize that how do you bound a problem so that you don't say everything is integrated and therefore you lapse into paralysis effectively because you don't know where to start, where to end. And we need these folk because they can help with the strategic conversations that's required across the disciplines and the professions to figure out how to understand and how to intervene. So this program, which we call a Masters in Sustainable Urban Practice, is our attempt to respond to what we see as an important demand. We hope that the people who emerge from this program will become the leaders in various institutional settings because they'll be able to perform as effective system integrators, but not just people who treat that as, if you will, an administrative or bureaucratic or managerial competence, but folk who are ethically grounded and technically competent. And it is that blend that we've tried to design into this program. So for us, when we did the curriculum design, we understood that the central task of these systems integrators are to ensure that transformative ideas, how to do things differently, to be low carbon, to be more inclusive, to advance circularity within the economy and so forth, to ensure that these transformative ideas or agendas, and in the program, we focus specifically on sustainable infrastructure, alternative land use and regulation, and the underpinning, which is network governance, how that can find traction and how it can resonate across the urban system and become the new normal, the new mainstream. So what we imagine is that we're moving towards a state or a system, a moment in time where the state and society all accept that this approach of doing urban development is indeed the only way forward. And so what we're trying to do is to connect a certain practice alive to what we call reflexive implementation and the role of these systems integrators. Now, some of the back-end thinking that informs this is that we believe that if we look at our outdated urban management and governance systems, we need a new institutional theory and practice that can create the enabling environment for a system's response to urban challenges. Now, this involves 4 domains of new practice. One is an acceptance that doing things in an integrated way, in a systemic way, is inherently complex, and that complexity has to be engaged with, but also needs to be translated into work packages that makes things less overwhelming for the different stakeholders in the system. That connects to the second set of imperatives, which is about facilitating participatory change. So what we now know is that unless all of the relevant stakeholders in a given urban problematic is part of the process, it is almost impossible to generate responses or solutions that will in fact work. But how do you do that? How do you work out who's in, who's not? What are the right amount of stakeholders in the process and so forth? Thirdly, we know that this idea between theory and practice as separate domains is a false dichotomy, and that these 2 things are in fact dialectically connected, that you cannot have theory without practice, and you cannot be an effective practitioner without thinking and having concepts to make sense of your practice and your learning. And finally, that to move a system from the status quo or from what it is to something very different, to an alternative, that there's a politics involved in that, and that a certain political savvy is required, and a capacity to read that politics and shift power is part of the skill set of an effective systems integrator. So these are some of the domains that live behind the kind of institutional theory that sits around the concept of systems integrators. So to take some of those abstract ideas and to make it very concrete, if we take the South African urban governance system as an example, and we look at some of the policy reforms from IDPs, with the 96 white paper and the Systems Act from 2000, and the iterations on that through the city support programs, through the integrated urban development framework and so forth, we recognize that there is now an understanding that, of course, the fundamentals of good urban governance is to provide basic services, to do that well, and to make sure that the absolute poverty and destitution is alleviated through effective service delivery. However, if one wants to have developmental outcomes that is more than the sum of the parts, you also need to be able to take some of these policy frameworks like climate change adaptation or LED or cultural renewal and stitch together interdepartmental interventions that can have those specific outcomes. Now, those are all about, if you will, the fundamental mandates of urban governance. But actually, just doing that doesn't solve the larger problems of spatial inequality and structural exclusion that we see in our cities. And to deal with those, you need high impact catalytic interventions that can shift the systemic dynamics of the urban system. These would typically be about 15% of the municipal budget. An experiment that we know has had very uneven results across South Africa over the last 20 years, of course, is public transport, and particularly BRT, as an example of a catalytic intervention. But we also know that in addition to that, in highly fragmented societies, political leaders need to lead certain social campaigns that can foster a shared narrative at the urban scale across the city. And so the question then arises is, what does integration look like at these different points of intervention and structuring of city governance activity? And this is not just from the perspective of municipal practitioners, but we're also trying to get at this from the perspective of all societal actors, whether it be grassroots organizations, intermediary NGOs, or the private sector. Now, to try and give a little bit of a sense of what are the capabilities that we are trying to harness through this program, we've identified a set of roles that system integrators play in highly fragmented systems. One, to convene and curate what we call deep conversations across the sector silos and societal domains. And this is a very particular skill, which is often very underdeveloped in most urban settings. Secondly, to inspire through comparative and historically informed storytelling, what it could look like if we do things differently. So, for example, we draw heavily on cases from successful examples of integrative approaches, whether it be in Nairobi or in Medellin in Colombia or in Delhi in India. But the idea is to be able to animate these curated conversations through very practical examples so that we can, in fact, build confidence that systemic change is indeed possible, even if always messy and difficult. And finally, none of these transformative ideas ever get traction unless we are able to understand the, if you will, almost hidden substrate of the urban system, which is regulation. So if you're not able to transform the regulatory legal systems of cities, and in the course we explore this idea of unbundling and hacking of these systems to achieve different outcomes. If you're not able to do that, it is very, very difficult to take new understandings, new narratives, and to sustain them from the point of experimentation to becoming the new norm. But there's an art to that, and how to do that is part of what we explore in the program. So this just is a way of visualizing the journey that we think is involved in moving any urban system from fragmentation to integration. The starting point, of course, is that in any system, there needs to be a recognition of the validity of an oppositional claim or a critique. So let's take the issue, for example, of homelessness, right? So we've seen a rapid increase in homelessness in the wake of COVID and the economic crisis that it engendered. We also saw a regulatory freeze as a part of the emergency response. So people couldn't be forcibly removed, they couldn't be relocated, etc., as a humanitarian response. So, but there's a recognition that we don't have an effective response to this. And that recognition now lives within the society at large through the public sphere, but also within the municipality and NGOs who've worked in that space. The idea is to take that recognition and figure out how do you make it a new normal? How do you make it the mainstream in public policy? That involves what we call embedding. You've got to embed both within the state and within society. And those are different skills, but they have to be connected. Successful embedding in the state means you've got to institutionally mainstream that new understanding. And that means it translates into explicit new strategic priorities, financing mechanism for those priorities, new regulations to drive systems change, and of course, accountability and learning mechanisms. Now, none of those things are self-evident. And certainly what we've seen is a tendency to rely on consultancy firms to generate those things, which we think is an error, is a mistake, that you need that to be organically developed by the different stakeholders who have a vested interest in the problem. And because a lot of these issues are really complex and interdependent, we think, looking at international precedent, that innovation labs are a useful way to learn what that alternative might look like and to test in a safe way before you make the big leap to a new mainstream. So part of what this program is trying to do is to enable the participants to be able to lead a journey such as this, whether it be in a specific policy domain or more broadly speaking within an urban agenda. We think there's a number of key sensibilities that has to be developed and honed to do that well. They are criticality, being propositional, being reflexive, and being translational. I'll say a little bit about each of these. So when we say criticality, we mean the ability to decipher and explain the political economy of urban change. So we get very irritated with the idea that people think that if you just say the right things, you talk about the right to the city, or you talk about resilience, that is enough. We know it's not. You need to understand what are the power relations that hold the mainstream in place and how to unravel that strategically. And a big part of this is to accept that we are in a market-driven urban or spatial system. And so you've got to know how to hack those processes. Secondly, you've got to be open enough to discern moments for resistance or empowerment or proposition. So often within the academy, there's been a tendency to continuously see how neoliberalism unfolds. And it can be very disempowering. And what we are trying to do is to suggest that the political terrain, the policy terrain is a lot more fluid. And there are many more opportunities for resistance or alternatives than is often recognized, particularly within academic discourse. And lastly, reflexivity. This is about understanding what are the inherent limitations of purposive planning and development, to know that whatever from a public policy point of view is envisaged will always have unintended consequences, unforeseen consequences. And how does one work with that level of uncertainty and complexity and paradox? The next sensibility that is structured across the program is to be propositional. And we do think that we are living in an incredible moment of experimentation and an openness to new ideas and doing things differently. And this involves always thinking across different scales. It also involves recognizing that there are real, meaningful new opportunities that have emerged through technological platforms. But this is not about being seduced by technology, but understanding the catalytic potential of technological platforms. And so we experiment and explore that as well. We also think that being fluent in systems thinking and institutional change in particular is critical. And a systems integrator has to have a nose for what we would call disruptive change and how to unlock that, how to catalyze it. And finally, a reverence for the necessary dialectic between public pressure through direct action and deliberative policy solving. It's not either or, but it's about how these things are curated or calibrated, if you will. Then thirdly, being reflexive. This is really about being comfortable with heterodoxy, to understand that there are always multiple ways of reading things, of thinking about things, and that diversity of perspective is essential for the kind of innovative capacity that has to be generated to problem solve. To be politically alert and astute, but not be dogmatic. And again, I think we've seen a slide into a certain kind of certitude, a certain kind of dogmatism, both within sort of critical activism, but also with people who work in the technocratic managerial spheres. Performance management is going to solve all of our problems. Let's just get those systems right, for example. To be ethically grounded and, if you will, wired. And lastly, to be entrepreneurial and to kind of hustle for opportunities, to be opportunistic, to always move agendas forward when the opportunity presents itself. And finally, and this is really this intermediative function of systems integrators. And this is about capabilities that refer to being alert to cultural differences and inequalities in society, to be completely comfortable within one's own skin and one's own disposition, and to read and navigate group dynamics. And finally, to both have and to convey a deep passion for learning and maybe a little bit pretentiously what we call becoming, this kind of a better version of ourselves that we're always striving for. And so the way we've that's all baked into what is maybe a more conventional way of presenting what this program entails. There's 4 compulsory core modules that takes urban transitions as the starting point, identifies infrastructure as the domain of greatest potential for transformation because it aggregates capital and resources, to then look at adaptive urban management because this is fundamental to all urban work. And finally, how do we leverage the resources and deploy the financing to implement this agenda? Students will then have a set of electives that they can choose from, and 2 of those have to be chosen. And this is very tightly connected with ongoing research clusters and communities within ACC. So students get access to people who are very much at the cutting edge of their field, but also access to live research projects so that we can keep this engaged, practical, applied energy throughout all of the modules. And then instead of a full academic thesis at the end, students will be expected to produce 2 research reports, which is rooted in their practice. And we are hoping that this is a way that we can ensure that students have an ability to directly relate the content of the modules to their own institutional setting where they come from. And they can either reflect on their own practice in those institutions, or they can anticipate interventions that they want to mount within their organizations.